So, with this little journey, we will enter, once more, the grim part of our journey. In the course of the month of October, we will explore the Underworld, more precisely, the different Underworlds across the world. One little journey each day for the entirety of October. 31 little journeys. Apart from this one, they won't be that long, I hope. But before we can properly dive into the Underworld, Underworlds, we need to understand a few things first. So, let me guide you through the basics. Beginning with the types of Underworlds. We begin, as any good traveler should, by mapping the unseen. So, the Underworld is not a single immutable place. It is a family of imaginative solutions to one insoluble fact, that the body ends while memory and meaning go on. Across the world, the dead's realm takes several recurring shapes, and I shall present 5 of the main types. Beginning with the first, the subterranean realm of shades, aka the place beneath. So, this is the classic image, a shadowed domain under the earth where the dead persist as attenuated versions of their former selves. Neither lies radiance nor complete annihilation. The Greek notion of Hades fits this mold, a somber kingdom ruled by a stern householder, where ordinary souls dwell in a kind of pale continuity rather than ecstatic reward or torment. The emphasis here is on permanence and a certain ontological sameness. Existence continues, but diminished, like a candle burned low. The literary and encyclopedic tradition treats the Hades as this archetype of the subterranean place of shades. But variants of the subterranean model appear also elsewhere. The Mesopotamian land of no return, or also known as Kur Ikala Kuku Irali Kigal, and in Akkadian as Arshetu, likewise evokes a dusky, earthbound continuing of existence, rather than a moralized afterlife. The Mesopotamian portrait stresses inevitability and diminution. Food of dust, a house underground, relatives pouring libations from above. The next one, the judicial or administrative afterlife, aka the court and record. In this type, the afterlife is less a landscape than an office of accounting, because we did not have enough bureaucracy in our lives yet. Souls stand before judges, records are consulted, and fate is appointed as if by law. This model is lucid in early Indian and Egyptian conceptions. Vedic and later Hindu thought assigns Yama and his retinue a role as arbiter of the departed, while Egyptian funerary literature stages the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at before Vizier, aka Osiris, and the entire ensemble of the dead, which we have covered in detail already. In these worlds, one's deeds, name and ritual credentials determine destination. The afterlife also functions as moral bureaucracy. Efficient, so that's the difference to our bureaucracy, solemn, and if one has read the forms correctly, well, that sounds more like ours, survivable. Yes, you can survive the afterlife. So, administrative motives also surface in Chinese popular religion, Niu for its multiple courts and judges, and in later popular imaginings where cosmic justice is dispensed as if by magistrates. The motive reassures, the cosmos has order, wrongs will be seen to, eventually. Our third one, the journeyed underworld, passage gates and ferries, not that kind. Here, the underworld is a route, rather than a residence, a voyage, a procession, a sequence of thresholds. The dead must travel, be ferried, cross rivers, or pass through guarded doors. The Greek ferryman Charon, and the various named rivers of Hades, there are quite a few, give a quintessential image. The dead pay their fare, for example via gold coin, then are escorted across and arrive, hopefully, on the other shore. In Mesoamerica, the Quiché Maya describe Xibalba as a place of rigged trials and liminal houses the soul must negotiate with. The Aztec Mictlan requires passage through layered obstacles. The Egyptian Duat, which we already know very well, is also properly a journey through zones, gates, monsters, mostly snakes, and spells, though its ultimate aim may be union with the sun, aka Ra, or paradise of fields. For example, the Paradise of Vizier. The pattern emphasizes process and performance rather than simple residence. So, journey models often produce clear ritual prescriptions for the living. That means what to place in a tomb, which words to know, which animals or companions to supply the traveler with. The practicalities follow the cosmology as faithfully as a map follows a river. Next, we have something really good, the Blessed Isles and otherworldly paradises. Elysium, Tirnanog, Macmel. Not all traditions imagine the afterlife as pallid or punishing. Some conceive paradisal realms of endless youth and plenty. Islands or fields where favoured souls live in a perfected echo of earthly joy and bliss. The Greek Elysium, also known as the Elysian Fields, is the classic exemplar, originally reserved for demigods and the especially favoured, later broadened in some authors to include the righteous. It lies practically at the Earth's western edge. Celtic underworlds, Tirnanog, Unwin, or Macmel, likewise present paradisal spaces where time loosens its hold, sickness is absent, and abundance reigns. Such visions answer the human yearning for restoration. If life is brief, then perhaps some portion of it may be preserved intact. So, paradise models are often, who have guessed it, politically and religiously charged. What a surprise. Who qualifies for permanence, and on what grounds? The answer? Well, heroism, divine favor, ritual purity. They tell us what people value most. And the last one for today, the cyclical, transmigratory, and transformative schemas. Samsara, rebirth, and return may ring a bell. A very different solution makes death less terminal and more transitional. The self moves on, is reborn, or the souls into a continuing cosmic process. Self-Asian systems, for example Hindu or Buddhist, place rebirth and karma at the center. Death is one turn of a vast wheel, not a final destination. Ethical actions alter future states within samsara, and liberation, which would be moksha or nirvana, ends the cycle. Similar motifs of return, reincarnation, or ancestral continuity appear in many indigenous traditions worldwide. The Underworld is sometimes a station in a longer circuit, and this model reframes fear into pedagogy. Behave well, and the river will carry you differently next time. So, cyclical thought tends to de-emphasize single, spectacular end states. No single paradise, nor single pit of punishment. Well, that's a plus. And therefore, changes the rhetorical stakes of funerary rituals. Rites may be for hiding the next life, for fixing a single eternal fate. So, but how do souls even reach the underworld in the first place? So, we have here a few different methods. First, by ferry or river crossing. The waterway is a boundary. You see, many people imagine the line between life and death as a river or a strait, for water is liminal, it separates, it hides, and it moves. The Greeks put this idea in stark relief. Styx, Acheron, Lethe, Plekton, rivers whose names tell us how the living spoke of death's moods. And Charon, the grim ferryman, who accepts the gold coin and bears the soul across when burial rites have been observed. A traveller unburied or unpaid is not a guest but a lingering shadow. The river's banks mark law as well as geography. Let the image sit, a small coin under the tongue, a rowboat and fog. The world's simplest travel voucher. Next, we have by guided pilgrimage or ritual path, basically a funerary map. You see, some cultures give the dead a map to walk, not a single crossing to pay for. Egyptian funerary literature, as we know, treats the duat as a staged route through gates, caverns, and hours of the night. The Book of the Dead and the Underworld supply spells, names, and directions, so the deceased may answer correctly to guardians and pass safely, or pass at all. Here, passage is a matter of knowledge and performance. You are not simply transported. You must know which name to call, which door to open, which formula to intone. The living, therefore, place texts, amulets, and diagrams beside the dead. Basically, practical instruction manuals for the long nights. Then we have, by natural boundary and descent, thresholds in the landscape. Often, the route to the other world is a visible breach in the ordinary world, a cave mouth, a cliff, a sacred slope. In Japanese myth, the boundary Yomotsu Hirasaka, the slope of Yomi, also the slope of darkness, marks the edge between living and dead. Descent beyond the slope is literal and irreversible after certain rites are consumed. Elsewhere, sacred caves, mountain passes, or undersea grottos serve the same function, thresholds that enfold the dead into the realm beneath. Such geography insists that death is not some abstract point, but a place you can actually visit and name. Then we have by moral or karmic consequence, basically the life-made roads. In other systems, there is no single ferry or single gate because the shape of the afterlife follows the shape of one's life. Rebirth and karmic consequence are the clearest statement of this logic in South Asia. You see, action shapes future states, and rites aid the passage or the next turn of the wheel. Analogies appear in many indigenous American and Andean beliefs where the cosmos is stratified. For example, Ukupacha in the Andean cosmology, and one's social ritual status, offerings, or moral behavior condition the dead's destination. So, basically, you build your road while you walk it. And the last one for now, by violent, honored, or premature transition, the special summons. You see, some doors open only for certain kinds of deaths. A warrior felled in battle may take not to the subterranean plane, but to a hall of the honored, the Norse Valhalla, or Freya's Folkvangr. It is slain, live for renewed martial existence until Ragnarök comes. Other exceptional deaths, for example sacrifice, drowning, and sadly childbirth in some systems can likewise call a different destination or expedite process. These arrangements tell a culture what it honors most. The manner of dying can be as decisive as the manner of living. In general, note the following. One does not usually queue politely at these doors. Some are ferried, some must recite passwords, some must find a cave, some follow the tally of their deeds, and some are invited by the gods themselves. If the Underworld had a reception desk, trust me, it would be overworked and a trifle blunt about customer service. Now, we have talked about the different realms. We have talked about how to get there, but what do you actually need to reach the Underworld? So, here are a few items. First, a coin for the ferryman, payment passport, and a tidy, actually working bureaucracy. That's when you know you're in the afterlife. The bureaucracy actually works. So, in many river crossing myths, this simple subject becomes the most important. A small coin tucked beneath the tongue or laid upon the ice. Basically, the ancient world's equivalent of a travel card. In classical Greece, the obol, or similar small coin, was placed with the corpse as payment for Charon, the ferryman who guided souls across the nether rivers. The gesture does more than bribe a lonely boatman. It signals that the dead have been rightly buried and rejoined the social order. It provides a recognizable identity token for the transition, and it reassures the living that the journey will not be impeded by a missing fare. Archaeology and literature both show the practice was widespread, though not universal, and its martial form varies with time and place. Next, funerary spells and ritual words, basically maps, passwords, and names. So, if a coin buys passage, a text negotiates it. When the afterlife is conceived as a road of thresholds, the living supply the dead with speech tools, spells, names, and liturgies to be spoken at gate or to the guardians. The Egyptian corpus is the paradigmatic case. The pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead contain spells that identify the deceased, teach them the names of beasts and doors, and offer formulae to escape harm. Equally, many shamanic and indigenous systems laugh in the face of silence. Words, chants, and the correct sequence of ritual acts protect and orient the traveler. So, knowledge is often the traveler's strongest talisman. Then we have the typical grave goods and offerings, sustenance, tools, and companions. Around the world, the dead are buried with belongings, pottery, food, weapons, mirrors, tools, sometimes even animals. And these grave goods serve several pragmatic and symbolic functions simultaneously. You see, to feed and clothe the dead, to provide tools for work or defense, to carry signs of status and identity, and to maintain social ties by martial means. Museums and recent scholarship remind us that these objects are not merely goods, but active agents in a ritual economy of memory. They anchor identity, enable action beyond the grave, and show how communities attempt to preserve relations across the boundary. The commonality of this practice is striking, though the forms and meanings vary widely, depending on the culture, of course. The next, proper rites and funerary status, basically social license to cross. You see, some doors will only open for those who were properly seen by the living, In cultures with strong ancestor cults and filial duties, correct rites, timely burial, rites of mourning, annual offerings, are the social proof that authorities, passage, and keeps the bound between worlds intact. Chinese and East Asian traditions, with their deep, multi-generational ancestor cults, show how descendant activity maintains the dead's welfare. Likewise, many indigenous systems require communal rites to send or settle a soul. So, basically, death is a transaction between the living and the dead, and the living must complete their sides. And lastly for now, heroic death or ritual death, the special invitation. You see, not all departures are equal. For some cultures, the manner of death itself opens particular doors. Warriors slain in battle may be chosen for martial halls, Volkwangerer from Freya or Odin's Valhalla. Sacrificial victims may be taken as offerings to a god's retinue, and those dying by certain fateful circumstances might be fast-tracked to a different afterlife. And these privileged destinations function as social rewards and cosmological signals. What a society esteems in life is sometimes institutionalized into where one goes after it. Thus, the community's values echo even into the arrangement of the dead. So, next, we're looking at the burial practices. There are, of course, different ones, beginning with inhumation with grave goods. Basically, equipping the dead for the road. So, across continents and millennia, the dead have most often been laid beneath the earth with things they might need. Pottery, foods, weapons, mirrors, jewelry. You know, the usual stuff. The catalogue changes by climate and wealth, obviously, but the logic is steady. If the afterlife is a place where one eats, works, or recognizes oneself, then supplies must be provided. In the Nile Valley and the Greek world, we see this logic writ large. You see, Egyptian tombs from the Old Kingdom onward were furnished with items for sustenance and function, while classical Greek burials often included pottery and the occasional weapon or token to mark status, as well as the one coin. Archaeology and mortuary architecture confirm a simple ritual calculus. The material investment at burial is the living community's wager that the dead will continue to need things, and that the community's memory and obligations ought to be materially maintained. Next, we have the mummification and elaborate preservation. So, basically, making identity endure. You see, when a culture believes the continuity of identity matters, that the dead must rise or be recognized by divine judges, preservation becomes an act of theology. Egyptian mummification is the canonical example. The careful removal of organs, the nature and desiccation, the wrapping, the amulets and the spells inscribed or placed with the body were intended to make the body durable, a durable vehicle. The Sa, the noble one, or the holy state of the mummy after a successful mummification process, for the soul's travel and for the rituals that would sustain it. The pyramid texts and later funerary corpora treat preservation as a prerequisite to the claims one might make before Vizier, aka Osiris. The living, therefore, invest enormous labor to secure that claim. Preservation can thus be read as a metaphysical technology, a way to keep the name and person intact for the scales of the hereafter. And next, we have something very interesting, and you will see why. Sky burials and excarnation. Basically, returning the body to the elements and spirits. In landscapes where timber is scarce, soil is frozen, or cultural cosmology prefers offering the body to the sky and scavengers, excarnation or sky burial, which is a pretty cool name, appears as a rational and ritual response. Tibetan sky burial, also practiced in parts of Mongolia and the Himalaya, involves exposing the corpse on a designated charnel ground so that the vultures and elements consume the flesh. Now, the act is framed not as neglect but as generosity, because the body becomes sustenance for other beings and is thereby reintegrated into the cosmic economy. So, comparable practices, exposing the dead on platforms, defleshing or leaving bodies in caves, occur in other traditions, including some Zoroastrian rites. Each expresses a theology in which the earth or sky, rather than underground house, is the appropriate repository for the remains. Practical constraints, permafrost, lack of food, that kind of stuff, and metaphysical commitments combine here to produce a ritual entirely consonant, and that is the important and interesting part with local geography. As you may have already noticed, the local geography plays a pretty huge role in all of the underworld beliefs. Now that we were talking about the sky, let's talk about fire, cremation, purification, release, and river dispersal. So, fire has been a popular and philosophically neat solution to death's riddle. Purify the corpse, release the soul, and send the ashes to sacred water. In the Vedic and later Hindu rite, the Antyeshti, cremation is the normative final sacrament. The sun lights the pyre, and the ashes are often deposited in a sacred river so that the deceased might be carried to ancestral realms. In many European faiths too, cremation has alternated with inhumation as the socially preferred disposal, and its meanings are multiple. You see, purification, transformation, expediency. But the theological thrust is similar. Fire alters the body's relation to the world and permits a different kind of passage. The practice therefore signals an afterlife geography where release and purification are emphasized over material continuity. And lastly, at least for now, secondary burial and ossuary costumes, basically stage transitions and social memory. You see, not every culture treats the disposal of flesh as a single final act. Many have staged procedures. Secondary burial, an initial interment or exposure followed later by collection of bones and reburial in an ossuary or family tomb, reflects a view of death as processual. First the body decays, then the bones are gathered and given a final place within a social repository. Such practices appear even from the prehistoric record into historic times, from Neolithic Europe through classical contexts. And in urban and crowded cemeteries, ossuaries have been practical solutions. But the meaning is also social and mnemonic. Reburial reinforces kinship ties, allows for collective commemoration, and turns the dead's remains into enduring points of communal identity. The ossuary is as much a social archive as a tomb. So, each of these techniques is an answer to a single question. What must be done to honor the dead and ensure their correct place in the order of things? The choice of inhumation, mummification, excarnation, cremation, or staged burial tells us where a culture imagines the afterlife to be and what form of passage the dead will require. Where the dead must eat, we provide food. Where they must be recognized, we preserve the body. Where the landscape forbids burial, we give the flesh to the birds. Where purification matters, we give fire. Where communal memory matters, we stage further rites. In our grim journey, this is not merely technical detail, it is the map of hope people build against the dark. Next, we have the afterlife geography and the requirements to traverse it. We now turn from categories to maps, the ways people have pictured the countryside of the dead, and the little instructions they left at the edge of the world so that travelers would know the trail. The underworld, when it is drawn on a card or a map, is seldom a bare void. It is a structured landscape of rivers and gates, houses and courts, deserts and paradises. Beginning with Mesopotamia, Erkala or Kigal, and that name may ring a bell. The subterranean land of no return. First, the geography. In the oldest Near Eastern vision, the land of the dead lies beneath the earth as a gloomy, shadowy domain, again variously named Kur Kigal, Erkala or Arsheto, is not a refurbished garden, so much as a deep city of the departed, houses without light, a dust-measured sustenance, and an inexorable sameness to existence. Sumerian and Akkadian poems, most famously the descent of Inanna or Ishtar, a topic we have already covered on this channel, depicting gates and guardians, and the realm ruled by the Queen of the Dead. And here is the origin of your ring bell, Ereshkigal, a place where one goes and cannot comfortably return. The imagery stresses diminution. The living become attenuated. The food is dust and the world above keeps its heat and movement. Now, on to the requirements to pass. Unlike the heavily ritualized map tradition of Egypt, Mesopotamian texts offer less of a portable instruction manual for every traveler. The only emphasis is on inclusion or exclusion and on the will of the underworld powers. In narrative sense, a heroic figure, Inanna or Ishtar, and Gilgamesh, in later Mesopotamian thinking, may kneel to appease rulers or to undergo symbolic stripping. But ordinary dead appear to enter by fate and stay. The descent of Inanna or Ishtar nevertheless records a sequence of doors and attendants, suggesting that, at least in mythic imagination, the underworld had controlled points of passage. So in short, submission to the underworld's keepers and the acceptance of loss are the motive. The myth offers trials for mythic visitors rather than a household checklist for every mourner. Now, the Egypt, the Duats, the night sea, gates and spells of a journeyed world. First, geography. You see, Egyptian cosmology famously turns the afterlife into a topography, not merely beneath one's feet, but woven into the nightly voyage of the sun. The Duats, aka the realm of the dead, is pictured as a segmented region of hours, gates, caverns, boatways, and monstrous guardians, and lots of snakes. The sunbark sails it during the nights, and the deceased are imagined to travel its same sounds. Texts such as the pyramid texts, coffin texts, the Underworld, which by the way is the journey of Ra through the night, and the later Book of the Dead elaborate a richly detailed geography. Named barriers, terrifying beings, again a lot of snakes, and precisely numbered gates or hours the soul must pass. This is cosmography made practical. The underworld is a road with signposts. Now, the requirements to pass, because the door is described as a sequence of locked doors and dangerous stations. The living furnish the dead with the necessary tools, spells written on papyri, the famous spells of the Book of the Dead, who, according to mythology, was written by Jehuti, aka Tuf himself. Protective amulets and names, and ritual rites such as the opening of the mouth, a very important ritual. To restore function. Success in the world depends on knowledge and correct performance. The deceased must recognize gods and monsters by name, recite particular formulas, and present the right magical objects. In Egyptian logic, textual competence and ritual technology are the traveler's passports, so to speak. Next we have Greece, rivers, ferries, and differentiated local within Hades. First, the geography again. Greek poets scatter the underworld with named waterways. Styx, Acheron, Lete, Plegeton, Kokytos, and place regions within Hades. The neutral Asphodel Plain, the punitive death of Tartarus, and the paradise Elysium, or the Isle of the Blessed, or the Elysian Fields. The picture is hybrid, part subterranean palace, part river Rhine archipelago, part judicial courts. Hades is at once an abode under the earth and a network of places with different moral and poetic balances. So, the requirements to pass. Classical practice and literary tradition combine. The ferryman Charon receives a coin, the obol or Charon's obol. A funerary rite performed by the living are repeatedly emphasized as necessary. Without them, the dead may wander, uncrossed. Certain poetic and philosophical texts, for example in Virgil, add punishments or delays for those unpaid. Other traditions and mystery cults offer alternative routes. Orphic lamellae, initiatory texts, that guide or alter destination. In short, ritual burial, a token payment for crossing, and, in special cultic context, secret passwords can determine whether one passes swiftly, wanders, or reaches favor. Next we have Norselands, Hell, Niflheimer, and selective halls of glory. Beginning again with geography. Early Norse cosmology locates some dead beneath the roots of the world tree Yggdrasil, in realms variously named Hel, Niflheimer or Niflhel, cold, misty, and shaded places governed by a goddess, Hel. Yet, the Norse landscape of the dead is plural. There are also halls of the honored, Folkvangre as Freya's allotment, and of course Valhalla for Odin's chosen stain, and grim margins such as Naströnd for certain sinners. The topography therefore mixes a general subterranean realm with exceptional locales reserved for particularly deaths. So, the requirements. Fate and manner of death are decisive markers. Warriors fall in battle may be chosen by Valkyries to join Odin in Valhalla or be allotted to Freya's Folkvangre. And those who die of sickness or old age more commonly end up in Hell. Grave goods, weapons and horses, appear in burial contexts, and saga evidence suggests horses and dogs were provided to accompany the dead in some instances. Where certain ritual acts and recognitions by kin maintain the dead's memory, the Norse schema thus privileges how one died as much as how one lived. The social value of martial value is literally institutionalized in the geography of the afterlife. And one final note here, hell is not to be confused with the Christian hell. It is just the name, hell, of the goddess, Hel. And then we have Mesoamerica, Xibalba in the Maya mythology, and Mictlan in the Aztec mythology. Layered trials and multi-stage passages. Again, first the geography. In Mesoamerican imagination, the underworld is often a stratified perilous routes. The Quiche Maya Xibalba is famous from the Popol Vuh, a city of lords whose domain is divided into deadly houses, the Dark House, Cold House, Jaguar House, Bat House, Razor House, and so forth, each a test. The Aztec Mictlan is a 9-layered descent, a long passage of obstacles, wind, obsidian, hills, rivers, culminating in rest or disappearance. In the house of, Mictlan Tecuhtli. These underworlds are not paradises. They are trials that require endurance and, in mythic accounts, cunning. So, the requirements to pass. The traveller needs offerings and helpers. In Aztec belief, a dog, often associated with the dog Xolotl, is an important psychopomp guiding the dead across rivers. Certain goods and ritual provisions aid the soul in its long passage. Mythic narrative. The hero twins in Maya traditions show that success may depend on Rus and sacred knowledge. In ordinary practice, grave goods and ritual attention by kin and community are the pragmatic means by which the dead are equipped for Mictlan or Xibalba. Now, Vedic or Indo-India, multiple paths, the Vaitarani River, and karmic accounting. First, the geography. South Asian religious texts present a plurality of destinations. Pitloka, the realm of ancestors, various Narakas, aka hells, and the broader cosmological cycles of samsara, in which rebirth occurs. Rivers play a significant role in the imagined crossings. The Vaitarani is described as a terrible river that the soul must cross. And sacred rivers, the Ganges, among them of course, are potent conduits for purification and transfer of merits. Now the requirements. Funeral rites, Antyeshti, mantras and offerings, including the cow offering in some texts, assist the dead's passage, ritual performance by descendants, the correct recitation of mantras, and the ethical tally of karma determine destination. The Vedic Hindu schema is therefore a hybrid of ritual facilitation, what persons and kin can do, and moral accounting, what one's actions have sown. Liberation, moksha, requires different spiritual practices, instruction, renunciation, or grace, and leads beyond the mapped afterlife into release from the cycle. And the last one for now, China, the Yellow Springs, the Yu, and the Courts of Judgments. First again the geography, Chinese popular religion, and later Buddhist-influenced cosmologies often locate an underworld called the Yu in the Mahayana or Buddhist popular synthesis, and the Yellow Springs in older parlance, as a multi-court, multi-stage system where the dead are received, judged, and purified. The system is, of course, bureaucratic, but again, a working bureaucracy. The dead may pass through a series of courts administered by Yama or King Yan and subordinate judges, each meting out sentences or mitigations. The geography is therefore judicial and purgatorial rather than a single static field. So, the requirements, the sentence offerings, memorial rituals, and the performance of merit transfer rites matter greatly. Burning of joss paper and the use of guidebooks or ritual texts help the soul. Buddhist and Taoist elements were historically grafted onto older folk ideas, producing a layered administrative afterlife where both ritual and ethical accountings shape the final outcome. So, what these portraits make plain is that geography and ritual are inseparable. You see, if the afterlife is a river, offer a coin and a boat. If it is a court, give names, offerings, and witnesses. If it is a labyrinth of night hours, inscribe the spells and lady amulets. If it is a field of plenty, then heroism, piety, or favor may be the key. Across cultures, the living are not passive observers. They kid out, instruct, and sometimes bargain for the safe passage of their dead. The map, a cultural truth of the hereafter, tells us what it feared and what it hoped for, and precisely what it thought the living could do about it. Now, the requirements for different afterlives. Who goes where? Beginning with the Greek triad, the Asphodel, the Elysium, and the Tartarus. Now, the Greek underworld is not a single apartment, but a small geography of manners and merits. Ordinary souls are commonly imagined dwelling in the Asphodel meadows, a grey place of shadowed continuity, where one continues without praise or torment. Elysium, the Elysian fields or Isles of the Blessed, is reserved for heroes and those singled out for divine favor or extraordinary virtue. Tartarus is the abyss of punishment, a deep and prison-like region for the worst offenders and rebel divinities. Entrance to these places is not uniformly bureaucratic. Homeric poetry often treats the dead as broadly equal shades, but later poets and thinkers and cultic practice distinguish outcomes by fate, heroic status, moral quality, or the will of the gods. So, virtue, heroic renown, and divine favor open doors to Elysium. Crime or cosmic rebellion consign one to Tartarus. The rest receive the neutral Asphodel. But why does it matter? You see, the triad encodes a social ranking into the afterlife. Exceptional deeds or exceptional grace are rewarded. The common are preserved, and sameness, the truly monstrous, are punished. The Greeks are thus wave reputation and divine caprice into eschatology. Now the Norse triad, Folkvangre, Valhalla, Hell, and a handful of other holds. So, in Norse conceptions of the afterlife are, once again, plural by design. Some slain warriors, those chosen by Valkyries, are received in Odin's hall, Valhalla, where they feast and prepare for the final battle, Ragnarok. Freya's Folkvangre is a parallel allotment where she receives half, or otherwise chosen, of the slain. And Hell, not the Christian Hell, just Hell, or Niflheimer or Niflhel, is the colder, more general abode for those who die of sickness, old age, or just any ordinary cause. The deciding factor is frequently manner of death, fallen in battle versus normal death. Sometimes social status or cultic recognition, and in certain sagas they will of deities or Valkyries. Grave goods and ritual acts also appear in the material record, signaling that the living could help equip the dead. But the Norse system places a heavy premium on how one dies. So, why does it matter? You see, the Norse arrangement institutionalizes material honor. Dying nobly can confer a cosmological upgrade. It's a society that translates battlefield values into the geography of the dead. Now, the Abrahamic models, aka heaven, hell, and the intermediate states. In the three Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the broad binary of reward and punishment is prominent, but each faith layers it with nuance and internal diversity. Christianity, for example, speaks of heaven as communion with God and hell as separation or reputive state. Many Christian theologies also posit intermediate conditions. Purgatory in Roman Catholicism, viably conceived intermediate states in Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestant thoughts. Entrance is typically judged by faith, moral life, and, in some traditions, sacramental or juridical process, final judgment, resurrection, or divine grace. The precise criteria and mechanisms depend heavily on denominational doctrine and theological debate. Salvation by faith, works, grace, or combinations thereof. So, why does it matter? See, Abrahamic models moralize thresholds. A life judged by divine law or mercy determines destiny. The intensity of theological argument about who qualifies shows how central eschatology has been to ethical life and communal identity. So, across these triads, a pattern emerges. Social values are encoded into eschatological geography. Where heroism matters, halls of the honored appear. Where ritual competence matters, spells and books are required. Where moral law matters, court and judgment do the sorting. Thresholds may be moralized, ritualized, accident-driven, or left to divine whim. And yeah, sometimes they are absurdly specific. The gods, or judges, or boatmen often keep very particular guest lists. One imagines a celestial clerk checking boxes. Hero? Yeah, stamp for Elysium. Drowned fisherman? Try Tlalocan, or suitable watery paradise. Murderer? Well, run the forms for Tartarus or Dieu. Now on to items and ritual acts, needed and why they matter. In Greek funerary practice, a small coin, the obol or Charon's obol, is placed with the corpse. And this coin is payment for Charon, the ferryman. Without it, the dead cannot board his skiff and cross the river that divides the living from the dead. The coin thus functions both as a practical fare and as a proof that the deceased received proper burial rites. In ancient Egypt, the dead are often furnished with small shabti figurines. These small servants are intended to answer the call to toil in the fields of reeds on behalf of the deceased. Basically, miniature laborers to perform agricultural tasks so the owner may rest if she or he wants to. Shabtis are therefore both practical tools and status markers within Egyptian afterlife ideology. Egyptian funerary papyri and spells, the Book of the Dead and its antecedents, supplying names, passwords, and instructions for the new words. These texts operate as navigational manuals. The proper formula spoken in the right place opens gates, pacifies guardians, and secures audience with judges. So, in short, written spells are legal technical credentials for the soul, and the opening of the mouth rite restores senses and agency to the deceased in Egyptian ritual. By ritual gestures and instruments, the dead are ritually enabled to eat, speak, see, and participate in the afterlife. The ceremony is therefore a kind of functional ordination. Without it, the deceased may be incapable of acting in the nether realms. Grave goods, pottery, food, weapons, tools, mirrors, and so on appear across cultures as provisions and identity markers. They feed the dead, provide implements for tasks or status, and signal social identity. Archaeologically, they form the material economy of burial and show how communities sought to equip departures. In Aztec practice, a dog, Xoloitzcuintli, may accompany or symbolically guide the dead across Mictlan's rivers and hazards. The dog functions as a psychopomp, a living emblem or grave companion that helps the soul find and traverse the correct routes. In Vedic and later Hindu accounts, the Vaitarani is a dreadful river that the dead must cross. Funeral rites, recited mantras and offerings, including the traditional cow offering in certain texts, are performed by the living to ease passage or provide a vehicle across this bridge. Ritual action thus directly affects the deceased's prospect in this posthumous geography. In Chinese popular religion, descendants burn joss paper and other spirit money as offerings to ancestors and to supply the deceased in Dios courts. These acts maintain the dead's welfare, may influence judicial outcomes, and preserve the reciprocal bond between living and dead. Ritual remembrance, therefore, functions as both provision and legal petition. Secondary burial and ossuary practices, where bones are collected and reinterred, serve as a social and spatial economy of the dead. Stage burial emphasize continued ties, reclaim bone as family patrimony, and serve practical space issues, while producing a lasting communal repository for memory and identity. Finally, the manner of death or heroic accolade can itself be an item-like credential. A warrior slain in battle may be taken to Valkyrie or Valhalla by divine agents such as the Valkyries. The manner of dying thus functions as an invitation to a privileged afterlife rather than a material token placed in the grave. Now, on to the history and development. First, what is the oldest known afterlife myth attested in writing? If we ask, which written texts give us the earliest glimpse of a fully worked notion of the afterlife, the answer is not a single heroic poem, but the ritual corpus of a king's tomb. The pyramid texts of Egypt, spells, utterances, and ritual formulae inscribed on the walls and sarcophagi of Saqqara pyramids and the late Old Kingdom are the earliest extensive written attestations of an elaborated underworld cosmology, dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE, roughly between 2400 and 2300 BCE. And those texts do not read like epic narrative in the Homeric sense. Instead, they are functional liturgies designed to secure the king's place among the gods and to guide him through the nether realm. For sheer antiquity and technical detail about the journey beyond, the pyramid texts stand first in the register of written evidence. If, however, we narrow the question to the earliest extant narrative myth, whose plot turns explicitly on descent into the realm of the dead. The Sumerian descent of Ishtar or Inanna holds pride of place among attested texts. You see, the surviving Sumerian tablets and later Akkadian renderings preserve a full tale of a wonderful goddess who enters the underworld, is stripped of her powers, and is, at last, restored. A dramatic template for later descent stories. The Sumerian version's surviving tablets were edited and transmitted in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Estimates vary around roughly 1900 to 1600 BCE for the extant reductions. Though the themes and ritual context that preceded the poem are demonstrably older. So, between these two poles, Egyptian funerary manuals and Mesopotamian narrative, other ancient texts also record poet and afterlife thoughts. The many layers of the Gilgamesh tradition, in its Old Babylonian and later Standard Babylonian versions, already engaged the problem of mortality and the netherworld. The search for Utnapishtim, the lament for Enkidu, with some tablets set down by the early 2nd millennium BCE. Thus, a developing literature of death, descent, and attempted escape or reconciliation appears across the Near East in Egypt in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, sometimes as ritual, technical, writing, and sometimes as heroic or mythic narrative. Here, a cautionary note. Writing presents only the terminus of a longer oral history. The fact that the pyramid texts or the descent of Ishtar or Inanna are the oldest written witnesses does not mean these ideas were invented then. Both draw upon older ritual performance and oral culture. What the surviving texts give us, however, is the first time that people map of the dead is committed to fixed words, and that makes them uniquely valuable. You see, the pyramid texts show ritual technique and cosmography. The descent of Ishtar or Inanna shows mythic drama and narrative structure. Together, they form the earliest documentary window we possess onto how ancient people thought the journey beyond was to be traversed. Second, where did these ideas originate? The short answer? Well, not in books, but in graves and gatherings. Long before anyone set ink to clay, people were disposing of their dead with care, and those practices produced an imaginative problem that required explanation and management. Archaeology gives us the earliest traces. Deliberate burials with grave goods and ritual coverings appear deep in the Paleolithic. Sites such as Kafsa, Eastern Mediterranean, and Sungir, northeastern Europe, show that tens of thousands of years ago, human communities already practiced intentional interments, furnished graves with ornaments and tools, and invested the dead with visible social meaning. Gestures that imply beliefs about personal beyond corporeal death, corporeal demise, and the need to provide for future states. And these burials are the raw material out of which later doctrines and mythic maps would be fashioned. With Neolithic came a new scale and density of ritual life. As people settled, built monuments, and developed complex communal rites, ritual architectures, enclosures, tombs, and cult places, such as Göbekli Tepe or Çatalhöyük, concentrated symbolic energies and produced more elaborate conceptions of cosmology and the dead. Communal funerary practices, ancestor veneration, and the augmenting of memory by collective rites are visible in this period. The dead were no longer only private concerns, but part of corporate identity and sacred geography. Monumental ritual sites encourage shared narratives and repeated performances, which, in turn, refined the social ontology of death. The dead were located, named, and ritually managed within the community's sacred topography. The invention of writing and the development of urban states then changed the form of these ideas without inventing them ex nihilo. Literate bureaucracies and royal cults, above all in the Nile Valley and the Mesopotamian plain, recorded, standardized, and sometimes sacralized rituals that had all their roots. In Egypt, for example, the pyramid texts and later coffin texts and books of the dead systemized spells and cosmography for elite burials, turning praxis into technical manual for the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, narrative poems such as The Descent of Ishtar or Inanna and the Layers of Gilgamesh articulated mythic drama about death and return. Writing allowed the ritual specialists and temples to fix formulas, codify the names of gates and judges, and produce durable instruction for the living to aid the dead. Thus, when literacy turned communal practice into a textual technology of salvation and memory. So, the origin story is not linear but cumulative and local. Shamanic and animistic sensibilities, ancestor cults, mortuary economies, and the elite cosmologies braided together in multiple places. Trade, conquest, and migration then spread and reshaped motifs. Rivers and ferrymen, judges and scales, paradises, and psychical rebirths migrated as cultural packages and were adapted to new social orders. So, in short, ideas of the afterlife grew from practical concerns: how to treat the body, how to remember the dead, how to protect the living, and became increasingly elaborate as social complexity. Ritual technology and textual authority increased. The grave came first, the temple and tablet came later, myth and law then made a doctrine from the living practices of many generations. Third, which mythologies claim these earliest texts? So, when we ask which mythologies claim the earliest written witnesses to afterlife thought, we are really asking which literary tradition first committed their myths of the dead to durable texts. Three cultural zones supply the oldest surviving documentary records that speak directly to the hereafter: the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian, and the early Indo-Aryan, more specifically the Vedic spheres, each in a different register and for different religious purposes. First, as mentioned already, ancient Egypt, Egypt's funerary corpora, above all the pyramid texts, later followed by the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead, constitute the earliest extensive written manuals concerned with the destination and navigation of the dead. These inscriptions, composed for the elite burials in the late Old Kingdom and thereafter, are technical liturgies. They name gates, utter formulas, and describe the sun's nightly path to the nether regions, which would be the Underworld, which means I'm in the Duat. Anyway, Egypt therefore claims the first sustained textual investment in afterlife procedure and cosmography. Second, Mesopotamia, or Arcadia and Babylonia in Assyria. The Sumerian and later Akkadian literatures provide some of the earliest narrative treatments of descent and loss. The Descent of Ishtar or Inanna, as well as its Akkadian analogies, preserves a complete mythic account of a god's entry into the underworld and the ensuing transformations. An explicit narrative engagement with this domain. The broader Mesopotamian epic tradition, including layers of Gilgamesh, also confronts mortality and the netherworld in literary form. Thus, Mesopotamia claims early mythic articulations of afterlife drama rather than the Egyptian manual-style approach. And third, the Vedic or Indo-Aryan corpus. The Rig Veda contains some of the earliest Indo-European hymnic references to Yama and to an ancestral realm, motifs that attest an early conceptualization of a domain of the dead and of an arbiter or guide. Though the Vedic texts are primarily ritual and hymnological rather than systematic funerary manuals, they preserve archaic theological frames in which an afterlife is already intelligible and discussed. Beyond these three centers, other literate cultures preserve important early evidence. Shang, China's oracle bone inscriptions, reveal intense ancestor cult and divinatory concern with the dead, though the oracle takes not full mythic narrative of the underworld, while Ugaritic and other Levantine tablets record deities and cults that intertwine with death imagery. But these traditions generally offer later or different kinds of textual evidence, juridical inscriptions, divinations, or fragmentary mythic cycles, rather than the extended funerary manuals and descent narratives seen in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, there is a final caveat necessary. Survival is partial. The claim of any tradition to be earliest rests on what text survived the accidents of preservation and discovery. Oral practice, ritual performance, and non-literate material culture long predate writing everywhere. What the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Vedic corpora give us is the first written form of ideas that are almost certainly older. Still, because these texts fix names, spells, and narrative contours, they are our earliest windows into how complex societies gave the dead a mapped and managed path. Fourth, development across epochs and regions. First, ritual magical elaboration, Egyptian corpus. The earliest long-running mode in which afterlife ideas were elaborated and systematized is ritual magical. Communities that invested heavily in funerary technology produced prescriptive maps and handbooks for the dead. In Egypt, this process reached extraordinary elaboration. Spells, coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead provided technical instructions, named thresholds and guardians, and specified correct formulae for each stage of the night journey. And these texts and their accompanying material practices made the afterlife legible and manipulable. Ritual, performance, amulets, and written words were the tools by which the living sought to secure identity, sustenance, and safe passage for the dead. Next, epic reflective interrogation, Mesopotamia and Homeric epics. Different development is literary interrogation, epic poetry and myth that makes mortality itself the subject of philosophical and emotional exploration. Mesopotamian epics, the Gilgamesh cycle, and related Sumerian narratives, and the Homeric epics treat death as drama and question, staging ascents, losses, and encounters with the dead to explore human finitude. These works do not primarily serve as ritual manuals. Instead, they hold up mortality to reflection, consolation, and social critique, producing a cultural repertoire of images and moral problems that inform ritual and belief without prescribing precise funerary technique. And then we have moral, eschatological models, later Abrahamic religions, and some Indian developments. As religious systems developed strong moral and juridical theologies, the afterlife increasingly took on adjudicative functions in later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and in parallel developments within certain Indian traditions. The hereafter becomes a domain of reward and punishment, of final accounting and cosmic justice. Eschatological doctrines reframe the afterlife as a site where ethical life is finally judged. Salvation, damnation, purgation, or rebirth are tied to doctrinal claims about faith, law, or karma. This moralizing turn changes funerary praxis too. Rites and intercessions are now aimed not only at navigation, but at moral standing in the sight of a deity or cosmic order. And syncretism and ritualization, Hellenistic syncretism, Christianization of pagan motifs, and indigenous continuities. So, finally, on the late Bronze Age onward, the movement of people, trade networks, and imperial politics produced intense mixing. Gods, rituals, and underworld motifs traveled, fused, and localized. Hellenistic syncretism grafted Eastern mystery cult and Egyptian imagery onto Greek forms. Christianization recast or absorbed pagan funeral customs and festivals into new ecclesiastical frameworks and indigenous traditions in the Americas, Africa, and Oceania retained distinctive continuities even as they syncretized with colonial religions. The result is plural once again. Regional afterlife, ecologies that recycle old motifs into new arrangements, so that a river, a judge, or a paradise may appear in diverse guises across wide geographies. So, like any good tavern tale, Underworld stories travel well and get a new embellishments at each stop. Fifth, patterns and recurring motifs through time. Now, if one steps back from the particularities of region and creed, a set of durable motifs emerges, figures and structures that recur with remarkable persistence, and though clothed in different names and garments. So we have the journey and its thresholds. The afterlife is almost always imagined as a passage rather than a static condition. Rivers, gates, bridges, and mountains appear again and again. The Sumerian seven gates of Irkalla, the Egyptian portals of the Duat, the Greek Styx and Acheron, the Zoroastrian Chinwad Bridge, the Vedic Vaitahani, the Chinese Naihe Bridge. These thresholds give dramatic shape to the idea that death is transition, not annihilation, and that the deceased must submit to ordeals of passage. And then, of course, guardians and judges. At nearly every crossing stands a figure of scrutiny: gatekeepers, serpents, ferrymen, judges. Inpu, or Anubis, weighs the heart. Yama precedes over the court Minos as one of the judges of the dead in the underworld, alongside his brothers, Aekos and Radamanthus. They determine souls' eternal fates after death. And of course the Valkyries select the fallen. The Maya lord of Xibalba set their traps. And these figures embody the sense that death is not automatic release, but conditional entry. The deceased must answer, pay, or prove themselves. And then We also have provision and equipment, whether in the form of grave goods, bells, offerings, or tokens. Cultures repeatedly insist that the dead must not travel empty-handed. Coins for Charon, Shabdis for the fields of reeds, dogs to lead one across rivers, text placed on a chest or tongue. These objects are identity markers and survivor gear. They transform burial from disposal into provisioning, encoding social, economic, and religious bonds into the next worlds. And then we have also sorting of fates. A fourth motive is differentiation. Most systems do not consign all souls to a single place, but distribute them by virtue, status, or even manner of death. Die Asphodel Elysium Tartarus Triad, die Valhalla Volkwangere Hell Division, the heavens, hells, and purgatories of Abrahamic theologies, the multiple locus of Hindu cosmology, all reflect the instinct to stratify the beyond in ways that mirror social or moral order. Death becomes the last census. And finally, renewal and continuity. You see, many traditions temper finality with hope of return or transformation. Cycles of rebirth, Hindu and Buddhist, paradise of abundance, Elysium, Tlalocan, or promised resurrections, Christian and Islamic, ensure that the underworld is not sheer extinction, but a stage in a larger story. Here, mortality is folded into cosmic renewal, turning the fear of loss into part of a broader metaphysical rhythm. Across epochs, these motifs surface with different faces, yet familiar gestures. Death is a road, guarded, provisioned, stratified, and sometimes leading to return. Cultures retell the same drama in many tongues, a chorus of echoes around the most inescapable of thresholds. And lastly, transmission, contact, and modern echoes. Ideas about the dead did not stay put, from the first local ritual to the empire's theology. Underworld stories traveled along trade routes, through conquest by missionary spokes, and in the quieter channels of folk memory. The result is a dense palimpsest, ancient maps of the beyond, overlaid by foreign rivers, borough judges, and newly popular paradises. You see, trade routes and pilgrims, long-distance exchange, moved gods and afterlife motifs as readily as it moved silk and spices. The Silk Road and related networks carried Buddhist, Christian, Necessitarian, and other teachings into Central and East Asia. Ideas about rebirth, judgment, and sacred geography traveled with monks, merchants, and manuscripts. And in consequence, Central Asian and Chinese visions of the beyond display hybrid features, local shamanic motifs grafted onto imported soteriologies, aka the doctrines of salvation, and imperial politics and Hellenistic syncretism. Alexander's conquest and the Hellenistic successor states created conditions for deliberate religious fusion. Greek, Egyptian, Near Eastern, and Anatolian cults met and were sometimes fused or rebranded. The cult of Serapis is the paradigmatic engineered syncretism. Under these conditions, theologies of death and rebirth cross-pollinated. Greek notions of the Isles of the Blessed met Eastern mystery rites and Egyptian afterlife symbolism, producing new ritual forms and popular expectations. And then conquest, missionization, and colonial syncretism. Where empires and missionaries encountered indigenous systems, syncretism often followed. Iberian colonization of the Americas fused Catholic feast days with native commemorations of the dead. Mexico's Dia de los Muertos exemplifies how indigenous Aztec and other Mesoamerican practices combined with All Saints, All Souls observance to create a living hybrid festival of remembrance. Elsewhere, the Atlantic slave trade produced creolized religious systems, voodoo, candomblé, santeria, in which African ancestor and underworld motifs were reworked under Catholic forms and New World conditions. These mixed religions preserved core afterlife logics while disguising or reinterpreting them within imposed frameworks. Then literature, art, and doctrinal reform, medieval to modern. You see, literary masterpieces and doctrinal debates reshape popular imagings of hell and paradise. For example, Dante's Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatory, Paradiso, is a central medieval rereading that systemized sins, punishment, and spiritual ascent in a way that filtered into later visual art and moral imagination. Renaissance and later artists repeatedly drew on Dante's circles when representing the underworld. Likewise, theological disputes on judgment, purgatory, resurrection reconfigured popular expectations across Europe and, by extension, mission fields. And everyday continuity as well as revival. Not all change as replacement. Folk costumes, grave rituals, and ancestor cults preserve older schemas, even where official religion or state power has altered doctrine. In many places, the official theology and local practice coexist in, well, uneasy partnership. Parish rites may be observed alongside household altars, and festival calendars will preserve pre-Christian or pre-colonial rhythms. In the modern era, there has also been conscious revival and scholarly recovery. Antiquarian interest, nationalist recoveries of indigenous rights, and the popular heritage movement keep older underworld imaginations in circulation. And, lastly, modern media and popular imagination. You see, the underworld survives vividly in modern culture, obviously. Film, television, comics, and video games routinely repackage ancient motifs. Varies across rivers, judges, paradises, and so on. For contemporary audiences, from cinematic ascents to fantasy novels and video game dungeons, the same structural elements recur because they answer perennial psychological needs to order loss, to dramatize justice, and to imagine reunion. So in short, ancient maps of the dead are not museum curiosities, but living narratives continually adapted to new media and new fears. So, lastly, for this first part of our grim journey, which got quite a bit longer than I hoped for. Anyway, transmission is neither clean nor uniform. It is, well, messy, pragmatic, and often tactical. Rivers and judges cross borders, not because they are identical everywhere, but because they answer universal anxieties in locally serviceable forms. Like a pilgrim who picks up a story at every stop, our ideas about death bear the fingerprints of many hands. And in course of this month, we will see a lot of different mythologies, a lot of different underworlds,